Hi, this is the twin stick shooter tutorial video. In this video I'll be going over the player experience, and after that I'll be doing a deep dive into all the blueprints that made all of this possible. I hope you enjoy. Hi, this is the gameplay portion of the video where I'll be showing you what the package comes in and how the proper player experience is, while also giving some of my thoughts behind what actions I took when making certain aspects of this game. So right here, as you can see, first of all, these enemies that chase you, which you can defeat by shooting lasers. There is a timer in the top middle that you can see, which is gradually going down. This indicates that the player is also a robot, as you can tell, and their battery continue going down. But with your laser, you can shoot the enemies and just drain their energy to charge yourself back up. I don't know if you can tell, but there is a slight power down noise that happens whenever a laser hits the enemy, and I use this to indicate, oh, you are draining the enemy, the energy from the enemy, which is quite neat, I believe. And right over here, I'm getting swarmed by enemies and I get defeated. So next, there's a bunch of, you might have noticed, a lot of walls and just obstacles in the map that at first are going to feel like quite difficult to deal with, since you have to remember where everything is, and you might think, oh, you bump into them and the enemies are going to catch up to you. But you can also think of it in the other way, where if you know where they are, the enemy can bump into them and you can make space, get some space between you and the enemy. So it really depends on how you think of it. For example, this hallway right here might seem like, oh, you can get swarmed by the enemies, but also if the enemies are swarming you, you can stand in one spot, keep on shooting, and eliminate a number of enemies, all by just standing in one spot and not having to do much. And whenever the timer hits 0, just like this, the player also is defeated and it respawns right back here. Another thing you might have noticed is the score and wave number in the top left, top right, I mean. The wave indicates the amount of enemies that are currently in the game at the moment. As you can see, the wave number just went up once all the enemies were defeated. To know how many enemies are at the start of every wave, it's the wave number multiplied by 5. So at first there were 1, which it was wave 1, so it was 5 enemies, and now it's wave 2, so there's 10 enemies. And keep on shooting and defeating them. And now it's wave 3. I very much enjoy this game. Although it's not the best game yet, but it's something that I put a lot of work into, and it's really a game where the more you play, you refine your skills, and you just keep on getting better and better. You can set personal bests for yourself. For example, currently the best I've done is get to wave number 7. One day I'll get to wave 10 and somehow defeat 50 enemies. But that's just part of the fun. For games, I believe, where you just set milestones for yourself that once you achieve them, it's one of those feelings that's just really hard to recreate with anything else. But back to the game, I did go for a very wide map, since at later stages there are quite a number of enemies, so a wider map really helps the player have more breathing room so that they can run away, and just to make some time to be able to actually take a breath and just get back into it. Another aspect that I went for the game is I got really swarmed over here. But this music is just great. But the reason I have the timer in this game is because I really like challenges, and I think a timer is one of the biggest challenges, as it forces you to manage your time. For example, do you want to run away from the enemies but that's going to cost you time, but you get to live for a bit? Or are you going to try and rush into enemies just so you can make sure you're making full use of all the time that you have? And it's really, you need to find the sweet spot and the balance between both of where you think is a good time to rush in and when's a good time to just run away. And you might have noticed, every time an enemy dies, the timer goes up by 1, which is similar to, oh, you're taking away their energy. I think I might have already said that actually. But this is, the numbers are increasing really much now. But once you actually get used to the game, it's really fun as you can just relax, stay back, and just destroy so many enemies and feel like the greatest player in the world. I just destroyed, what, 15 enemies right there? Oh, there's 20 now. But just like that, even while talking about the game, I'm getting so distracted because this is just a really fun game that I enjoyed making, and hopefully, if you get your hands on it, you get to enjoy playing this as well. Now I'll be focusing on some of the code. Now I'll start going over the blueprints that went into making this game. So first we have the blueprint, the enemy AI. So in this blueprint, it's very simple. Whenever begin play occurs, well, whenever the game begins, or when mostly the enemy spawns in, it's gonna call the function track player, and it's very simple function where it's just gonna, it's the AI move node, which is designed specifically for AI, just so it can optimize everything, and it knows to move AIs on the move volume, which is right over nav mesh bounds here. So it knows that's where to move, and it's getting the controlled pawn, which is itself, and it's getting the player character just so it knows where to move to. And obviously we have this as looping, just so it continuously moves to the player. Otherwise it would move to the player once, and then it would just not move again, and it would just stay at the previous position of the player. Next is a really big one, which is the enemy character. So this, as you can see, is a fairly large blueprint. So I'll take it apart one by one. So here's one of the most basic functions, which is damage the hero, and as the name suggests, it calls the affect health function, which is declared right over here. But it calls that function and it sends in hero as the target and damage as a delta, which is the change in health. And then this is the attack function, basically, where first the enemy is going to check, oh, I'm overlapping with something, and it's not the enemy checking, it is this damage volume over here checking, where it checks, oh, I'm overlapping with something. It's going to cast a hero character, and it's going to check, oh, is this the hero? And then it's going to start a timer, which is basically, the timer represents how often the player, the enemy can attack the player, and it's using the attacks per second, it's going to attack that many times. And here, if the player's left the range, then it's going to stop all timers. First of all, it checks if it is the player that left, but it's going to stop all timers, because you can't have the enemy attack the player when the player's nowhere near it. And now we get to this behemoth. It looks really complicated, but it's a very simple function, and all it does is decrease the health of the enemy. So here is the event affect health. So what this does is it's going to calculate the health. It's going to it's targeting itself, so it's going to calculate its own health, and it's going to take in the damage, which is, we feed it over here, we're taking damage. But this can be called by other functions as well. So it calculates the health, then it checks, oh, is the enemy dead or not? And if it is, it's If it's not, it does nothing because this false node's connected to nothing. But if it is, it's gonna, all of this is basically, it stops colliding with everything. So if the enemy has fallen down, the player can almost run through it, other enemies can walk over it. It's kind of rude to do to your allies, but it's up to them. But it's stopping it from just attacking the player or moving towards the player as well. And here it's changing the damage volume to ignore, where so you can't attack the player if even though you're already dead. And here it's going to increase the countdown, which is part of the addition that I added, where here it's incrementing time, which is a function in the game mode, which I'll get to in a bit. It's going to increment the score, which is also in the game mode. And cast the twin sticks, basically it's getting the game mode from this node right here and changing those functions within it. After it's done all that math, it's gonna destroy the as the comment says, destroy the enemy after a 3-second delay, where it's detached from controller. Basically means, oh, AI controller is basically like, I'm not touching you anymore, you're gone. And then it waits 3 seconds, and here we call basically the explosion in the game to happen, so it can look cool. This transforms basically where the explosion is going to happen, and pretty simple now. Destroy actor, target, self, and that's basically all enemy does. It doesn't seem like much, but this is one of like the core parts of the game. Next up is also a pretty big one, which is the enemy spawner. This is also a really important one. It's just one big node, but it's also extremely important to the game. So it calls this function spawn enemy. It doesn't call it itself. It's just declared over here, but it's called in the game mode. So what spawn enemy does, it gets every single enemy in the entire game, or the level, and it's checking for the class, which is BP enemy character. And what it does is it gets the length of the array, like how many. It first wants to see, okay, how many enemies are there. I'm gonna check, oh, is it less than 1, which is effectively, is it 0 or less? And then it says, oh, there is no enemies left. Then it's going to increment the wave number, which basically means, oh, you defeated all the enemies in the previous wave, now it's time for a harder challenge. So what it's doing is it's setting the wave number to 1 plus the previous wave number, so it's always incrementing by 1. Then it's setting the max enemies that there can possibly be spawned at a time at start enemies, which is declared, so you can change it around. Right now I have it at 5, and the wave number, which we incremented right here. So, oh, it's wave number 2. 2 times 5 is 10, so that's 10 max enemies. And it's gonna set spawned max to, it's not doing anything really, but it's just leading the node. Spawned max, it's just setting it to false over here because the max aren't spawned anymore, since before we checked over here it's less than 0. But that leads all the way to here, where it's going to get all the actors on the enemy again now, and it's going to check, okay, not check, but it's going to start spawning more enemies, because it's like, oh, we don't have enough enemies, gotta start spawning more. So what it's doing right over here, it's getting the spawn volume, and basically it's getting the location, getting like how big of it is, and then it's just getting a random point in like within the spawn volume, just so it knows, okay, I have this massive area that you just choose anywhere in between that and spawn an enemy there. And then it's checking if the max have spawned. If yes, then spawn max to true, otherwise you just do nothing. So what you do is get all actors again, all the enemies, check the length, and check, oh, is it less than max enemies? If it is, do nothing. because you already spawned an enemy. But if it's not, that means, oh, I've spawned the max amount that I can. And if right over here I'm checking, and this is if there's more than one enemy, that one or more enemies, it's checking, oh, are the max amounts spawned? Which is basically asking, do I need to spawn more enemies? And if it's true, well, it's more false is, I guess the best way to word it is, I don't need to spawn any more enemies, right? And if it's true, well, it's going to do nothing. But if it's false, back over here, spawn more enemies. It can be a bit confusing, but the simple is, I check if I need to spawn enemies. If true, I'll spawn more. Otherwise, I'll just set max to true, so that means no more enemies need to be spawned. Second, we have a fairly shorter one. It's only a few nodes, and this is the explosion. Basically what happens whenever you defeat an enemy, where whenever this is called, it basically plays the sound of the explosion that you hear at the location of the actor, basically itself. And this happens every time this spawns in, which is, this is only spawned in as you saw in the enemy. Where is, right here, as you saw in the enemy, it basically spawns in every time the enemy is basically destroyed, right over here. So it called itself, plays this explosion sound and spawn emitter, and emitter is basically the animation of the explosion. It spawns this, then the delay of, okay, let the animation fully play out. It's a very small delay, it's only 0.2 seconds, and then it just destroys itself. Like, oh, animation's done. You're not needed anymore. And next is the big part. It's the player character, the hero character, which you basically control. So there's a lot of stuff. So we'll start from the top, and this is when the game starts. Basically, when the player spawns in, it's gonna do everything in a sequence where it's do this, then do this, then do this. So the very first, it's gonna set up your weapon and attach it to the player. First of all, it gets the location of the player, which is the mesh right over here. It's gonna get your weapon, it's gonna spawn it in, and basically it's gonna attach it to the player. It's really simple, and socket name is basically attaching it to a socket that I made in the blend space, where it's kind of like a socket is like a bone, but more of the part like connects two bones, and it spawns it right over there, and so it's always attached to the player since it's part of the skeletal mesh. And then we move over here, set the player spawn location in game mode, which basically means, oh, game mode, this is where the player needs to spawn every time the player dies. So basically telling the game mode that this is the player's original position and just spawn it there every time. Very simple. You get the game mode, and in the game mode you set the value of player spawn transform to this actor's transform. And this is also a big part, which is adding the UI. It's just two nodes where you create a widget blueprint, which is what this says. Twin stick HUD widgets, a big node, but it's just making a twin stick widget, which there's right over here, and it's making one, and it's adding that to the viewport. Very simple, very quick. The movement part over here, where it's fairly simple. So in input axis move up, where in project settings, right over here, down in input, I'm setting move up to be W and S, which is 1 and -1. So what this is doing over here is basically the add movement node. It's taking the axis value. So this knows if W was pressed, multiply 1 by 1, so just to move 1 forward, which is X. But if I pressed S, it knows, oh, multiply this by -1, that means move 1 backwards. And if nothing is present, so it's multiplying by 0, so just stay still, you don't have to move forward or backward. And same thing's happening for move right over here, but instead of W and S, it's A and D. So rotation is fairly similar to movement over here, where instead of you got move up and move right, you got look up and look right, which is mapped to the arrow keys or the right analog stick on a controller. And what it's basically doing over here, it's making a vector, checking if for at least looking up, if it's moved more than like 25%, that's to make sure if it's really moved out enough for the player to properly be moving. And basically it moves it on set control rotation, makes the player look that way that you want it to based on the analog stick, and it calls to make a short delay, and this delay is to make sure that the player fires, calls the pull trigger, release trigger, which fires the gun in the correct direction, because if the delay is not there, it's going to shoot a laser from its previous position and then turn. So delay really important, otherwise there would be a bug. Pull trigger and release trigger, they're located in the weapon over right here, where I'll go more detail into them in that part. But as we move on from there, to take damage, and if the health gets 0, it's pretty simple stuff. It calls the effect health function, where it's going to calculate health being from the C++ base class script that we've written, and it's checking, oh, am I dead? Where if the player's health is 0 or less, they will be dead, and if that returns true, kill the player, function right over here. This over here is a very small thing, it's just a quality of life, where if you're in the package, you can just press escape and you exit out of the game. It's just to stop the menial thing of having to tab out and close the game manually. But this kill player function over here is quite the beast. So what this basically does is going to calculate health, and if health was not already 0, it doesn't really check, but it guarantees that health is set to 0, so it gets the current health of the player, times it by -1, and then adds that to the player. Basically saying, yeah, even if you had 0.001 HP left, it's still 0, because -0, so 0.0001 HP results in 0. It's going to disable input, so you can't move the player anymore, and then it's going to delay to let the death animation of the player play out. Then it's going to respawn a new player from the game mode, and then it's going to destroy the previous player. This is because if we destroy the previous player first and then spawn the new player, the game bugs out. That's why we have to always spawn it and then destroy it, and the game is really fast. So these two right here happen in an instant. You barely ever even notice them happening. So that was all the player, and now we move on to iDamageable. Not much to show here. It just has one function, which is affect health, and it takes in a delta. You've been using it quite a bit right over here, and it's just a really good function. It's made in iDamageable because it's something that can be assigned to multiple blueprints, and it basically says, yeah, this, all these are damageable, and if you're damageable, you can call event health, which just basically means lowering your health. Next, we move on to the projectile. This is what gets all the blood pumping when you just destroy so many enemies at the same time. So what it's doing right now, at the very first, so whenever it begins overlapping, which means whenever it collides with something, it's gonna check, oh, did I hit an eye damageable object. I did? Okay, that's good. Then it's gonna check something else. The thing I hit, was it not a friendly? Making sure that anything that was hit, as long as it's not a friendly, this goes through. And then it's gonna affect the health of whatever I hit by the damage that I deal, which is the projectile's damage, which is -20. And it's -20 because affect health adds this delta to the health. So if you do negative, that means you're actually dealing damage, and positive means healing. So spawn sound attached, basically play the power down when it actually hits something, and get the laser mesh, which is basically what's attached there, and you get the you're spawning an emitter, which is like the laser sparks that happen whenever you hit an enemy. They look very pretty, and this is basically you get where you need to spawn them, and then you destroy the projectile. And here, if it's colliding with something and it's not an eye damageable, just destroy it because it already collided with something. You don't have to do all this complicated stuff. You hit something, the laser's gone. Next, we move on to the game mode. Now this is a big one, because this controls almost so much of what happens in the game that the game cannot function without this. So at the very start of the game, it's gonna first of all start the timer. That's gonna keep on going down, and it's gonna get all the enemies and basically start spawning them. It's going to call the spawn enemy function, and it's going to spawn this many, basically 2 enemies every second, just to control the speed of how they start spawning. And this is basically what is calling the spawn in the enemy spawn right here. Let's keep on calling this function to spawn a new enemy, and that's happening twice every second. So next we got another really important one, respawn player. So what this does is once the player is dead, this is called, and first of all it's going to destroy all the previous enemies because you don't want those lurking around. And once that is, this loop body says, oh, destroy this, and this goes through, this gets the array of all the enemies, passes that in, and then in each and every, it goes through all that entire array and destroys every single enemy. And once that's finished, it's gonna spawn the player at the location provided, which we give right over here. Respawn the player, and we set it right over here. Spawn, no, not here. This right here, player spawn location. And get the location, you know where to spawn the enemy, you now possess the newly spawned enemy. Basically that new enemy, before it was just a skeleton, but you're the soul that just gets pushed into it, and now you can actually control it, get the player control in there, and now it's resetting the cooldown, countdown, sorry, and putting the number back to where it the start time, and resetting the score back to 0, and resetting the wave, just making it feel like the game just started. So the next part in this game mode that I have is decrease the countdown. And it's called every tick, basically that means every frame, but what I'm using is delta second, and delta seconds split up that frame into basically saying this many times per second. So that means it's frame independent. So if you have a game that's running at 120 frames a second and one game that's running at 10 frames a second, the timer is going to go down the same amount no matter what, which is very good because it does need to appear like actual times going down, and it prevents a lot of bugs from happening as well. So it's decreasing the countdown by basically the amount of delta seconds, and it's setting that to the actual countdown value. and then there's a branch. It's like, oh, am I less than 1? Did the time run out? And if it does, oh, countdown to 0, so it doesn't go into negatives when the delay happens, where like the player's dying and the animation's playing. It doesn't go into negatives, and it basically destroys every single hero character, and they call it kill player. You don't really need the all actors of class, but in future, if I do ever add multiple hero characters, then this is very useful, so I'm just keeping it here. Excuse me. And then I just call the kill player function, which is in the hero right over here. So basically destroy the player. And that's just a lot of the game mode. And then there's just two very similar functions over here, increment the score and increment the timer, where if you defeat an enemy, this is called, and it increases score by just the score whatever is set in the enemy, how much every enemy's worth, and setting that to new score. And increment countdown, where every time you defeat an enemy, it just increments the amount of time you have by 1 second. And now it's the weapon, your most trusted companion in this game. So here's the release trigger function that is called in right in player right over here. Also the pull trigger, which is right here. So first I'll describe release trigger. So when the trigger is released, that means when you stop pressing the arrow keys or holding the analog stick, it's just going to stop shooting. And then it's just resetting the timer. But what happens when you pull the trigger is it's going to do this once, so you can't just forever hold it down and just shoot out almost a full-on laser, not even bullet form. But it basically calls the fire function right over here, and then it starts a timer. And that timer is how many shots can be taken per second. So that basically limits the gun to not just have a full-on, just infinite amounts of lasers shooting and you just holding it down. So what fire does is it's going to spawn the sound, basically play the shoot sound at the gun mesh, and then it's going to spawn the projectile where you want it, where it's the arrow projectile spawn point, which is just an arrow in this viewport right here. And that's all it does. It just spawns this, and then it's just there, plays this awesome sound, and every time once you release the trigger it just stops shooting. Otherwise it's just going to keep on shooting as long as you're holding the trigger down, that is. That's all that the weapon does. So next you go into the widget right here. This doesn't look much in the event graph, but what this is doing right here, if I go in designers, this is how it looks like. It has your health, which is a scroller, you have your time, you have your score and wave, and this basically controls everything. You have wave, where it's getting actor of enemy spawn, and it's getting the wave number from it, it's converting it to text, integer version, and then it's returning that, and what it's returned is basically what's displayed here, since it's binded to that. Not here, right here. It's wave, it's getting the wave number. And same thing happens to all of these, where timer, it's getting the timer, gets the game mode, goes to game mode, gets countdown, converts an integer, does a bunch of conversions, and returns it. And health bar, a bit different, where it gets the base character, it gets health, and it divides it by 100, so you have a percentage of health, and then it returns that. So the slider, you can really just see the health going up and down in the slider. And lastly, similar thing happened to score as in the countdown, where it gets the twin sig mode, it gets score converted to integer in text form and returns it. And that's it for all the major blueprints in the game. Yet these few things can make this entire game happen. And all the animations are controlled by the animation blueprint character, where it's just playing all the animation, it's setting speed, it's setting rotation to check, is the player rotated to the right, to the left, running to the right, running to the left. If it's an idle, it gets direction. Casting it to base character, it's gonna check if the character's dead, and if it is dead, it's just gonna play the death animation, and it's gonna get one random integer. So it's gonna play one of these three animations, and it's just works. It just all together, this one massive node, this one blueprint controls just all the animations that there are, and it's just so wonderful. Here it's a state machine where it gets this, it finds out which animation needs to be playing from the random integer in here, and then it plays that animation. And then there's the animation blueprint enemy, which just does all the same stuff, but instead it does it for the enemy. So, because they do have a bit different animations, the enemy is always just moving forward, it is not really moving left and right. And that's it. Just all those things together just make this game that you can just see, and it's hard to tell, but it's there. And the outliner over here, let me just expand that. You got the nav mesh bounds, which is basically this circle right here. I can move it up a bit, which basically decides where the enemy can and can't move. You have player start, where the player's spawning. You got the explosion that's just happening. You got the enemy spawner that's gonna spawn enemies, and the way I have it, where all the enemies are gonna be spawning here. So it's really like a maze where they spawn and they start going all the way through to you, and the walls, everything, and that's about it. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, got a bit more deeper insight into my game, and just thanks a lot for watching. Have a great day.